So I'm Carole Cadwalladr, a journalist formerly with The Guardian and Observer, no longer, now very fully on Substack. We have Peter Jukes, who is the co-founder and executive editor of Byline Times. And we have the amazing Sergei Cristo.
Hello.
Sergei is our Conservative Party insider whistleblower. And we all came together last year to make a podcast. Actually, it wasn't last year. It took us longer than that, which Sergei will tell you about. It was a long and traumatic journey. But eventually we made, how many episodes was it in the end, everybody?
10.
10. It was 10 episodes, Sergei and the Westminster Spy Ring. And that in itself, it wasn't just a podcast. It was actually not the end result, a middle result of a very long running campaign, which the Citizens, which is the non-profit which is hosting this Substack, initiated way back in 2020. So to just go back into the mists of times briefly, that was mid-pandemic, and we suddenly had published in Britain the Russia report. This was a report which Boris Johnson had personally stopped being published before the critical 2019 general election. That was the general election in which Johnson got the mandate to Brexit, and he refused to publish this report before it. Anyway, long story short, although if Sergei tells it, it's a very, very long story because I can't tell short stories. Long story short, that report is published in 2020. And the biggest discovery in it is that the security services had basically done no investigation into foreign interference. They couldn't say whether there was or wasn't any because they literally had turned a blind eye. So at that point, we pulled together a group of MPs and members of the House of Lords to challenge the government on why Boris Johnson was refusing to have an inquiry into foreign interference. And our view, well, the view of the lawyers, the view of the MPs, was that we cannot actually protect British democracy unless we know what foreign interference is, what shape it takes, how it works in the digital age. And we've been fighting that battle since 2020. And the idea for the podcast came out of the fact that it's such a complicated topic. Nobody really understands it. It's all been in bits and pieces. So we thought what we'll do is we will smuggle this complicated story about politics and information warfare and the Kremlin and foreign into this story of spies and espionage and honeypots. And that was when I had the idea of bringing in Sergei, who is the ultimate insider who from 2011 tried to blow the whistle on what the Kremlin was trying to do in Britain. Sergei, do you just want to introduce yourself briefly?
Hello, I'm Sergei Cristo. I used to be a fundraiser at the Conservative Party. I'm still a member of the Conservative Party, hoping that at some point it will move back to the center ground of politics. And at the moment, I'm a student. I'm finishing my master's, excuse me, at a European university because I decided to study as a proper sort of just a normal student background to what we've been looking at from the academic side. And I have actually come up with some interesting points.
What is your specialist subject here, Sergei?
It's global security and strategy.
Global security and strategy.
Yeah, strategy, yes. So what I think, I know that Carol thinks that I'm unable to, I cannot tell a quick story, but I think so far the legislators in Europe and Britain have been looking at it from the wrong point of view, because they've been focusing on the easiest part of the Russian campaign, which is online. But the way that the Russians structure it, they have different elements to this campaign. And one of them is covert political funding, but also other assistance, and it comes as a package. So unless we actually address it as a package, whatever we're doing on the online side is not going to be effective.
I'm going to challenge you there, because you say that they're focusing on the online side. They've done nothing whatsoever to investigate the online side or to protect against it, I would argue. But you're going to counter it. But I tell you what, let's go to Peter at this point, because come on, snap awake.
Wake up, everybody!
Wake up! Wake up!
I'll play my guitar if you're.
I know you had to. We
That
had a threat.
That will wake everybody.
That Peter was going to play his guitar. We've managed to see off that one like a well-directed Russian missile through.
Well, Carole was playing Katusha before we started, which is a song about missiles. So
totally inappropriate.
It's totally inappropriate. I mean, managed to save you all from that. No, I think the online thing. I'd be fascinated to read Sergei's research, and he's written on, by the way, on Byline Supplement, an obituary of a very important figure in this whole story, Oleg Gordievsky. But just on the online thing, which kind of emerged, I think, as when I came on board last year, was the online side, the digital barbecue, which I've been invited to, and we realised, didn't we, Carole, in the way of just looking at what Nolobin, the key figure, the political first secretary who made the first approach to Sergei, what he's also doing in the information space, and how clever they were at talking to bloggers and alternative media, and then establishing that as one of their attack vectors. And then I don't think Carole might not want to talk about this. What emerged, and I'd see this online, horrific abuse that Carole got, was talking to an Estonian senior intelligence officer, saying that, oh yeah, that would have been organized. As soon as Carole, led the way on this, Russian interference stuff became put ahead over the parapet, there was probably a team working on her, psychologically profiling her, bots activated, somehow inadvertently, a lot of the right-wing media establishment also activated to call her mad cat lady. And this was a highly targeted destabilizer operation. I say this is relevant, not only because I saw a friend of mine go through that awful trauma, and it was awful, but also this is going on now. America has ceased in the cyber command to counter Russian cyber attacks, it's stepped down all that. And if you see a paid influencer who was indicted, or rather a warrant by the FBI last year, receiving part of this $10 million that Russia today was funneling to American influencers, Tim Pool, he's now a reporter at the White House. So the floodgates have been opened, and everything that Sergei saw, everything that, in a way, this sort of story of Westminster tells you are stuff that's going on now around the world.
Peter, let me just stop you there. So
I have stopped.
So some people are saying that they're having problems. They can't hear it. Weird, both work for me. I'm on iPhone. I don't know quite what's happening. Some people can hear it and some people can't, it seems. But
is that everybody? Is that you can hear me?
Also, Peter, have you got your Zoom turned off, because your sound's a bit ropey?
It's off. It's in another room. I could turn it off.
That's all right. So actually, so that was great. Thank you. So Sergei, maybe that was kind of interesting in talking about what I found making the podcast. The most interesting thing to me about it was that I thought this was a story that I knew pretty well. And actually, what it turned out, that when we started piecing it together, when we started putting the chronology together, we started layering things through, there were definite revelations for me that came out just through that process. A lot of it really just putting the chronology down, as Peter said, really seeing the different spectrum of things which the Russian embassy in London was doing. And then the second thing which came out in that was, well, we found out more information than I ever thought we would about why we believe the Russia report was suppressed. That was another revelation for me. And then I think I also, I found the sort of, some of the people, some of the information we got, especially in the later episodes, about really the sort of sophistication of the operation in Britain and the really determined efforts by the British government to bury this episode. It was definitely a sort of eye-opening process for me, and I wonder, Sergei, if you found that too.
Well, at the time when I wasn't studying, a lot of it was also a revelation to me. But then I moved to France and I started talking to journalists there, and they told me about what happened in France, which was fairly, more or less in a similar mode what the Russians were doing in France. Slightly differently, we're using slightly different approaches because of the the type, for example, in France, they used the old white Russian emigres, for example, because of their connections with senators and so on. There was a slightly different methodology. In America, again, in Germany, they were slightly different. But the weaponization of covert political funding and online campaigns and so on was very similar. And then, of course, I realized that because the Russians use more or less the same tactics all over Europe, academics have already had a pretty good picture of how this Russian methodology works. In fact, at the moment, the Minister of Defense is someone called Valery Gerasimov. Valery Gerasimov is famous because in 2013 he published an article which then became became the basis of the so-called Gerasimov doctrine, which was termed by Mark Galeotti. Mark Galeotti at the moment is advising the foreign secretary. So the Gerasimov top doctrine is basically based on the belief that whether the country is in war or not, it's always in the state of war. Russia is always in the state of war with the West. It always treats it as an enemy, and it constantly prepares for proper military action. So they basically said that the way they treat the West is that they constantly kind of try to soften it up with various active measures. And that's why we see GRU, which is military intelligence, propping up every time there's a question about a bot campaign, in the middle of the election campaign, or there is a covert funding to a political party. GRU keeps popping up all the time. It's because it has a central role within this Gerasimov doctrine.
And I think that's the sort of really key point, isn't it? I mean, this was, something that really came up in the Skripal case in Britain, which, at the time, I felt very profoundly that Britain really didn't take the full import of what that attack was about, because, as you say, it was military intelligence. It was a military attack. And, the funny sort of insight I had into that is because I know Salisbury really well and understand that the thing about Salisbury is it really is the centre of the British military establishment. Stonehenge, which is at Salisbury Plain, which is around the town, is the biggest military training ground in Europe. And the officers all live in Salisbury. So it seemed like a very symbolic, apart from anything else, attack on the kind of with impunity on the British establishment. So, Peter, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I think GRU connection is really interesting. And this is where we should talk about something else, is the way it was denied by the British media establishment. So I was told by somebody at the BBC, Prigozhin had nothing to do with the GRU. It's complete Prigozhin, Evgeny Prigozhin, who ran the troll farms, who ran Wagner. Bellingcat was sued for many years in the British courts for saying he ran Wagner, which he clearly did. He died mysteriously in a plane crash when he rebelled against Putin. The British establishment constantly trying to deny these connections, and that's partly lawfare. That's partly because the Russians are very good at destabilizing information and making sure that's not true. I was told many times, oh, the Gerasimov doctrine, 5 years, doesn't mean that. Or Alexander Dugin has no influence. The Caroles, it's a mad Russian conspiracy. Now, it's so interesting, especially after 2022, the biggest land war in Europe, that the second invasion of Ukraine, let's make it after the first in 2014, people now find that undeniable. We mustn't forget that at the time, Boris Johnson could scotch and bury the Russia report because everybody else was saying it was a mad conspiracy theory. Russia really doesn't want to do this. We've tracked that was an intent. There were military plans laid out, even the US Army outlined it under Trump. And I do find it very disturbing or very clever the way the Russians managed to not get RT banned, the way they managed to make us look like conspiracy theorists. How did they manage to achieve that?
Yeah. You know what was really interesting? So I was in Canada and I've just been in Turkey. And I had real flashbacks when I looked at my phone because on Twitter, RT is still there. So it's that thing. It's like it is actually banned now in Britain. And you realise seeing it again, just how noxious that influence is. It was just all over politics, really reactive, really clickbaity all the time. But Sergei, can you you know, we talked about in one of the last episodes of the podcast this sort of question about, you know, actually, you know what you were saying there. Russia already believes it's at war with us, arguably. We're in denial in not understanding that and not understanding actually the level of jeopardy and risk and threat in Europe at this time is much higher than perhaps the government or the mainstream media is really realizing or communicating, would you say?
Yes, I think you know, within the Gerasimov doctrine, it's called the concealed means of warfare. So it is warfare. You know, from the Gerasimov doctrine's point of view, they are at war, and that's why Putin constantly says that, you know, they are at war with NATO, not just with Ukraine, because they have started this concealed war since probably Brexit and the first election of Trump. And it's interesting also what Peter said about the BBC. It's a total mystery to me why the BBC denies talking about, doesn't want to talk about political interference in Britain. Because, I mean, talking about the St. Petersburg troll farm and saying that it had no connection with GRU. I mean, I read all this academic stuff, and I kind of sometimes complain to myself that the academia is too slow sometimes to react. But in this case, it seems to be ahead of the BBC. Because, I mean, I was just writing something yesterday in this book here, which is about offensive cyber warfare. It basically talks about, you know, and proves that farm had direct links to GRU. I mean, it's known in academic circles, been proved. The BBC, I think, is afraid. It's part of the establishment nowadays. You know, it's highly dependent, unfortunately, on the license fee and obviously number 10, the government. Every time, you know, they try to use that level with the BBC when it comes to for renewal, the license fee and the Royal Charter. But I think they're really afraid of opening this whole can, because one thing is theory and they know how the Russians operate, but another thing is opening actually the British case and showing not just it's not just about MPs being sometimes funded by strange companies and so on that have Russia, but there are also things like think tanks, various training programs. I mean, we've just heard about Reform UK apparently using the new kind of US style PAC, which is a kind of US style funded body, which is going to train their candidates for the next general election and do things like, you know, that strictly speaking, under the UK legislation today, do not have to be declared through the Electoral Commission. So they're using all these little loopholes already, and potentially there may be massive money coming in to that sort of activity.
So just briefly, so we're going to be, so just to let everybody know, we're doing a live event. I don't know if it's been announced yet. It's going to be in London at the Greenwood Theatre. I don't know if we'll try and stream it, or at least we'll do a film of it afterwards. Do you know, Pete, can you, either of you two, remember what date that is?
On the
17th. And it's a lovely, I think it's 17th. 14th, so 14th.
14th, okay.
And it's a lovely theatre, and it's a very nice environment.
And we're going to have Chris Steele is coming. We're going to have a couple of special guests. There'll be different parts to the evening. But I suppose one of the key things, what we're trying to do here is this is an ongoing campaign. This topic is not going away. We actually have done nothing to protect our elections against foreign interference. I think what Sergei was talking about there about Reform UK, I mean, it's not just reform, but this question about there's so many different channels for dark, undetected money to enter UK politics, for that influence. As you say, the think tanks, as we know, have been a huge and ongoing influence. That's just one of the different ways. Peter, do you want to say something?
Well, just one of the other revelations from the podcast was from Chris Steele, who did submit evidence to the Russia report, which is redacted. But he indicated that his evidence was that Russian money came to Brexit through various partnerships. And so we have that sort of ongoing embarrassment of riches, let's call it that, which, let's be clear, like when there is a name we reported on, apparently KGB had a name for Trump way back when as an asset. That doesn't mean somebody is working directly for the Russians. It means they have something over them. We're just embarrassed by them. That's where the think tank comes in. For we know that various prominent politicians, we name some of them coming to the conservative friends of Russia. But for example, just an example, I'm sure he's just slightly embarrassed by it. I've challenged him on Twitter about it, or X as it's called now. He doesn't really want to talk about it. I'm sure he's not a Russian agent. But a certain Harry Cole, who's now been appointed to the court of Trump from the Sun, their former political editor, former leader of the lobby, there's pictures of him on a freebie to Moscow, 2011. You ask about it, he says, "Oh, shut up, you conspiracy theory." That's the way they work. That's when you get invited to the embassy, like I was. Thank God I didn't go. It's not so much you're actually suborned. You're embarrassed. You don't want to talk about it. And that's the clever way they sort of throw money at things, lavish events, invite you to things that people get steered off this. And we have to be just very wary. In a way, it's the truth and reconciliation I think we need, Carol, as well as this investigate. Look, I went along to the embassy. I didn't, but lots of people did, not knowing this was happening. I feel embarrassed about it now. We should declare these things. And the great thing is, the one thing that was in that DCMS report, which you submitted evidence to, much more than I did, Carol, but you did, was there should be a Foreign Agents Registration Act here, as there is in the US, even though the US are ignoring it these days. And that has been instituted. Progress does happen. David Lammy, when we did this report in 2019 about the DCMS committee report, said, "This is awful. Russian interference, we've got to do something about it, we've got to have an investigation," right? He hasn't done that, but they have instituted FIRS, Foreign Influence Registration Scheme. And Russia and Iran are now the top of that. You have to declare if you're taking money from them. So we mustn't, in all this activism, the great work that Citizens is doing, be positive, even though it's incremental. It's minuscule change. Change can happen, especially on this issue.
Well, and just to sort of recap on this, which is that, so what was, just to sort of explain a little bit about the ongoing legal case, which is still going through the court. So it's now in the European Court of Human Rights, and we've got 3 MPs who are still, I think actually 2 of them are ex-MPs now, but still backing that case. And what was really novel and interesting about that case, and it's why the European Court has elevated it to be a case of significance, because it has direct relevance to what's going on in other European countries, is something in the legislation. It's called the investigatory principle. And really, it's again, it comes back to this concept that we can only protect ourselves going forward if we understand what has actually happened already. And one of the really interesting cases, which is we're going to see this in action, is the Romania case. So that's the first time we've seen that, in which a country has set aside an election result because of credible allegations of foreign interference. In this case, Russia using TikTok. And that is a massive landmark. But to go back to, we actually had a question coming in from somebody, from Anne. She says, "Do you think part of the reason that a full independent investigation of Russian interference has not occurred is because it would raise too many questions about the validity of the Brexit referendum?" So I have to say, Anne, I would definitely say so, and I think that comes out in the podcast. What about you? What would you say to that, Sergei?
Well, I think it's obviously, any ordinary person you would ask, they would say yes, although from the legal point of view, of course, it was an advisory referendum, and legally there is no way of reversing it, even if there was an illegal how can I say, underbelly to it, because it wasn't an election. And I think
So I'm
that
going to interrupt you there. We don't need to prove that, actually, Sergei. We actually have proven, and it has been admitted, that there was gross illegality in the referendum by the domestic Vote Leave and Leave EU campaigns.
But if you actually think carefully about how Boris Johnson and co framed the Russia report and the conclusions and the recommendations of the report to instigate a proper, is it a feedback from? Sorry.
Okay.
Can you hear anything? No,
Fine,
so
it's fine.
I'll just go.
Good.
It was actually Boris Johnson and co who let me just try to shut this down. Who sorry, I can hear my.
Fine, Sergei, don't worry, just keep going.
It's Boris Johnson and co. who politicized the conclusions of the Russia report, basically. It was them who linked the conclusions immediately with Brexit, who said that, of course, we don't want to talk or investigate Russian interference because this is all about Brexit, which of course wasn't. I mean, a lot of people who pushed for proper investigation into Russian interference in British politics have been concerned about Russia long before Brexit ever came about. So the politicization actually came from that very Brexiteer end of the Conservative Party. They politicized it as linked with Brexit, not people who were talking about Russia.
So people talk about Trump and what possibly Putin, the way he collaborates with Putin, has over him, and this is where the notion of compromise is a complicated one, because it can just be compromising that Russian money was involved at all. I really think. Like, I knew one MI6 Secret Service agent. He said the key thing was just to get a potential target to take money, and you film them, right? So once they've taken any money at all, you can basically blackmail them till the end of time. You've got them. And I think even a tiny amount of money in Brexit so embarrassed the British state, they didn't want to relitigate it. And that's a successful compromise. It doesn't mean the whole of the British state colluded with Russia. All it meant that there was an embarrassment, and they hadn't investigated. And they get caught in this double turn. And that's why, to stop that happening again, and we're not relitigating Brexit. Brexit's happened. What we're doing is protecting from this ever happening again. It's anybody from any political persuasion, unless they're domiciled overseas and get their money from overseas, would understand that the people acting in election should be the people who live there. And
yeah. And I guess also, I mean, the whole thing about this is that, we began this campaign in 2020. We're now in such a different world. We're now in a world in which Donald Trump is directly aligned with Vladimir Putin, and that there's an entire new axis of power across the world, and we have to understand that we are caught in a pincer movement now between America and Russia, and our division from the rest of Europe is an active and ongoing threat to our security. And that's where I sort of think getting stuck in these sort of historic arguments is actually dangerous, because it's, as Sergei says, it's politicizing something which is much more profound and fundamental than that, which is about our national sovereignty and security.
And can I just add, Carole? I mean, what's happened since you started that amazing hard work you did in those early days. Kudos to Citizens you pursuing this. I only got involved in latter day Johnny. Is that it's no longer about Ramonas and Brexiteers. It's about hundreds of thousands of people dying. It's 40,000 people missing in Mariupol. It's millions of refugees, 5 million people, Ukrainians, living under Russian occupation. It's attacks, it's Bucha, it's Irpin, it's life and death. And that's one of the most moving things, I think, and apart from, of course, you two, Steve Lacey, our other interlocutor who goes down the rabbit hole. And then, pro-Russian, believes all the disinformation, and Lucas manages to change his mind a bit. Then he's dedicating his life to targeting and exposing these kind of campaigns, because friends of his were targeted by missiles in Mariupol. It's life and death. It's biggest war since World War II.
Yeah, that's right. I think, and I think going back to Britain in that, Britain is complicit. Britain laundered the money. Actually, we've got a question here from Claudia Barron. She says, is there another reason that the UK government doesn't seem to want to investigate? Could it be to do with money laundering and tax evasion? Well, I think the fact is that a large part of the British economy, the service industries, was still, actually there's an entire industry in laundering kleptocrats' money, and that goes on even though Russians have been sanctioned. So Sergei's looking amused at that. Do you want to jump in?
No, I was just thinking, I mean, let's just imagine government says, yes, let's investigate, have a proper forensic financial investigation of all the political funding of all the groups and think tanks. And can you imagine what they will find? I mean, not thinking of Russian funding, any other irregularities in political funding. This is going to be, they're just afraid what else they can find. I mean, it's a world which is riddled with all kinds of strange irregularities. And you can imagine, you know, if you even say Labour government, who maybe didn't benefit very much from the Russian funding, I mean, do you really open all your financial books to an independent police and intelligence service forensic investigation into your funding? They're afraid of what else they can find.
Yeah, but I go back to, I mean, it's going to be, we go back to this question about, because and you said to me, Sergei, that the online is the least of it, but the thing about the online aspect of it is that that's where elections take place these days, and it is, the way that I sort of describe it, it's an open threat surface that really sort of any number of bad actors can do all sorts of things. And there's always an open question about what effect that had, what influence. But at the same time, I always sort of respond to that by saying advertising is it a $2 million industry worldwide? I don't think people would spend that money if there was no evidence that worked after all.
The famous line of advertising, it's more like 20 billion, but is they know only 50% of it works, but they don't know which 50%.
Yeah.
I'd say, Carole, also and there is more information on this, I was reading up on it, is that all your work at Cambridge Analytica is very relevant here. There's more and more evidence that there was a crossover of targeting and data in the US elections between Cambridge Analytica and the Ogino Troll Farm, GRU. And I was reading some more evidence of that. And so online is not just like advertising, it's bespoke targeted advertising to your particular psychometrics. Everybody dismissed that, but that's what's gone on. Musk has basically turned X into a super targeting exercise. It worked rather well in November last year in the US election.
Yeah, so, and I think to go back to just that briefly is that the Musk of it, which European country he's going to turn on next. We've already seen that. That's using information and influence as a weapon. Who knows what he's got up his sleeve next? I think, really trying to think and plan ahead about what we need to be doing to protect ourselves is so crucial, because we are next in line after America. I mean, people thought this couldn't happen in America, and look where we are now, 100 days into the second Trump presidency.
But Carole, without plugging the newspaper, but the latest edition of Simmer of Discontent looks back at the riots, Musk was a key part in the biggest riots we've had since the war.
I know, exactly. Yeah, I mean, exactly. He has already incited violence, like, in this country. That is that was, and it was so interesting, because that did seem to be a trial run for. We thought if Trump hadn't won, for political violence in America. Listen, you know what? We're 33 minutes in, and I've only got 3 bars left on my phone. So I'm wondering, what do you guys think? Should we wrap this, or is there something which you would urgently like to say at this point?
Or I'd say we can carry on the conversation. The 17th of May at the Greenwood Theatre.
Well,
I'd love to see anybody here.
I know somebody put a comment in, by the way, which they said, "Oh, it's so annoying that everything's in London." You're right. I totally agree with that. But the Citizens is a tiny non-profit. Its funding is vanishing, because any work in the tech accountability space is dried up. That, in terms of the US, that's now seen as politics. So I guess if you can support the Citizens in any way, then trying to do more and reaching out to different communities. I'm very un-London. I always agree, which is things being London-centric. So I apologise for that.
We're hopefully going to get Sergei up to the Byline Festival, which is near Manchester.
There we go. And Sergei, do you have what's your final thoughts?
Well, my final thoughts may be, I would just say that, again, something I was reading for my work in the last few days. When they researched the Russian interference, bot interference during the election, they realized it was very targeted. It wasn't scattergun approach at all, and that was already a few years back. So when they, targeted conservative voters, they obviously talked about Trump. When they targeted black voters, they talked about basically either trying to convince them not to vote, or vote for third kind of party candidates that had no chance of being elected. And it's just kind of, I'm just wondering, thinking about Cambridge Analytica and the way they...
Yeah, that was exactly their strategy as well.
Whether
There was a clear crossover.
I was just wondering whether the Russians actually by this time already have more privileged access to data points on each electorate than we actually think.
Yeah.
That would be another.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that is definitely a thought, an ongoing thought. So, listen, thank everybody who tuned in. Thank you so much. We didn't think anybody was going to show up. This was so sort of, slightly, I won't say that because lovely Manassa from the Citizens organised things impeccably, but my own personal bit of it was a bit shambolic and disorganised, and we'd never done a Substack live before. So we're learning. Maybe, I mean, I would say we don't want it too slick though, so maybe a little bit of shambles is okay. But thanks everybody for turning up, and more soon.
Thank you, and hopefully see you on the 14th of May.
Yeah. All right. Bye.